This is the future session, and the format will be, I'll talk about 15 minutes about futures thinking as it relates to creating partnerships for a safer world. And then we have our panelists here, and we'll go through a foresight process, and then we'll pass it over to you. So just so you get a sense of the panelists, we have Natalie, who's a director at the Rockefeller Foundation. We have Usman, who's a director at Chatham House. We have Sanya, who's president of Heartfile Association and a former federal minister and formerly with WHO. And Marie-Paul, who's a director with INSERM and used to be with WHO. And Mark, who's the director with endingpandemics.org. So they'll be our panelists, and we're going to look at the futures of partnerships for a safer world. So let me start this process right now. And the first thing is really I want to focus on uses of the future. And the first way health professionals, other groups tend to use the future is very much as a warning. So in this case, if you look at the data you folks have sent on the website, it's things in the absence of interventions, AMR-associated human mortality is projected to soar, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very much the future looks bleak if we do nothing. Now the challenge with using the future as a warning, if you go back to climate change data, the first warning of global warming was in 1912. So it's not like a recent warning with Al Gore, it went back 106 years ago. So when you use the future as a warning, most people in terms of decision making, they go to something called zero loop. They freeze. The information you give them, because it disagrees with how they think, they double down on their viewpoint. So warnings tend not to lead to decisive change. Now why is that? And I don't mean to pick out any country, but when they asked recently, 30% of American Republicans believe that Aladdin's homeland, Agrabah, should be bombed. Now, when I run workshop this and I say, why do you believe that? People say, well, there may be blowback, or it's too expensive. Well, the real reason is Agrabah actually doesn't exist. So the challenge with zero loop giving warnings is we may not have enough information, perspective to make wise decisions. So the response then is, okay, what's the second use of the future is action. What's called single loop learning, let's just do it. Give me the problem, I'll develop a national action plan. Now that works except in times of accelerated social change. So the philosopher Sarkar says we're in a period what's called galloping time. Exponential change, which is difficult because it's complex, it's chaotic, it makes one anxious, but you can have exponential influence and impact. So as things become more plastic, your ability to change increases. If you're not careful, you can be Kodak. In the corporate world, it's called being Kodak. You had a product, you didn't adjust, you disappeared. The third use of the future is the future as a learning journey. So you think the world is changing, what don't I know? How do I figure out how the world is changing? So you challenge your core assumptions and say, let's develop a better strategy by learning about learning. So it's not prediction, but it's learning. And that means we have to ask the humble question, what don't we know, what don't I know? So for example, people say, get out of the box. In this case, she said, no, I want to stay in the box. So there's this thing, we should do things one way. She says, no, I need to be in the box. She's responding to anxiety that most organizations, most CEOs, most directors face. The world changes, it's too difficult, we become anxious. As well, when we do typical national action plans, national strategies, what we often forget about in our rational policy planning is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. We have a vision, it doesn't work, it disappears very soon. Who wants change? Everyone. Who wants to change? Pretty much no one. So this becomes the tension. The way out of that tension is something called narrative foresight. It's saying we have an unconscious story about the future, about health, about pandemics, about infectious disease. Let's figure out what that metaphor is, that story, and make a shift. So you have to find the right metaphor. With one large hospital in Australia, their current metaphor was the surgeon, the specialist, drives the Formula One car. Now, once we went through a foresight process of learning, their new metaphor, the patient drives the car, the surgeon, the specialist, sits by her, by him. So this new metaphor then sets up a new participatory strategy. But first they had to do what's called the narrative shift before any strategy would work. Many organizations are unable to change. They're unable to make the shift. With one large energy company, they paid for foresight work to look at smart meters, to look at solar, to look at energy sharing per homes. But when we asked them to make the shift in the board meeting, they just went to business as usual. So I was at that board meeting. After 15 minutes, I fell asleep. The board chair says, "Why did you fall asleep?" I said, "Because you're doing what you normally do. You paid for information about the future, but you refused to make a tangible change." So we shifted the metaphor. I said, "So what's your metaphor?" He said, "We're like Queen Elizabeth. We can't change. We have a monopoly." So we shifted the story to Queen Elizabeth with patrol boats. Patrol Boat 1 was a smart home. Patrol Boat 2 was energy-producing homes. Patrol Boat 3 was testing water quality. So their story didn't allow change. Once we found a better story, we produced action-learning experimental programs that could make a difference. I've been sat through today's presentations. I kept on thinking I was in a zombie apocalypse meeting. The number of speakers kept on saying, it's the first line of defense. We're in a huge combat. Let's mobilize the forces. Everyone's gaining ground. I mean, this is worse than the War of Terror. So basically, the military metaphor was dominant today. Now, that may be the correct metaphor, I don't know. With one hospital I was working with, they kept on saying, we're like the Titanic. They kept on having consultants attempt to innovate, but ultimately it failed because the core story was, we're like the Titanic, we're going to sink. Finally, the premier, the governor, had to dismantle the department. The fifth use of the future is, well, what's changing? What's actually changing in the world? So if you go back 40, 50 years, and you use the work of Michel Foucault, you get something called biopower. So the old imagination of health was very much more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Very hierarchical, very male power, very much normalized, here's what you should do. And during that period, you also get the notion of humans above nature. Each day, Humboldt supplies enough energy to melt 7 million tons of glacier. Most organizations wouldn't be doing that, and we know the direct correlation between climate change and future diseases that exacerbate it. Then you see 10 years ago, in many hospitals, in many countries, the rise of mindfulness meditation as counterpoint to smoking. So we see hospitals that use meditation, resource use drops by 42%. In Victoria, 34% of GPs actually are trained in meditation, and 77% believe it should be funded by the federal government. And now we see a shift again. It's not about if you meditate or not, it's about where you were born. The geopolitics of health, that decides your health life chances. Are you born in a poor place or a wealthy place? Even within wealthy places, do you live near fast food? Your chances of a stroke go up. So geomedicine becomes the new field. And the disruption we're now seeing the next 5, 10 years is, of course, the 3D printing of pharmaceuticals. I work closely with international police, and that's one of the big fears. Every home having their own 3D printer for illegal drugs. Now, the positive side, of course, is biofabrication. As this disruption goes further, using the future to see how might the world change, given the role of zoonotic diseases, there's this move towards something called supermeat. No animals are killed. It's developed without antibiotics. It's basically in vitro pure meat gained. So every home produces its own meat in pretty simple laboratory conditions. That used to cost $300,000 US, it's down to $10. Now, you may think that's a crazy idea, but then immediately billionaires like Gates and Branson come in, and they change the discourse. It stops being something crazy to something being normal. So the idea very soon, most villages, most communities will produce their own protein. The final disruption as we move forward is the Internet of everything, healthy, putting together all our intelligence sources in a real-time sharing of intelligence around how each one of us is healthy and can be healthier. That's kind of the cutting-edge stuff. But that all assumes this will happen. Maybe it won't. What are the alternative futures? The sixth use of the future is, what are the alternatives? And our panelists will give us great advice on that very soon. The first scenario is early intervention. Where do these bugs breed? Well, in hospitals. How do we get people to not go to the hospital? Early intervention, wearables, smart floors. The metaphor is the avatar comes to you and does early diagnostics, then you may need to go to a specialist. This is what's called the 4P model: prevention, prediction, personalized, and most importantly, participatory. Scenario 2 came out very strongly today, I thought. It's a big science and pharma innovation. New antibiotics save the day or old ones are brought back like octipeptin. And the metaphor was weapons in our armory. And the cutting edge, of course, is CRISPR, which may be able to eliminate microbes that cause disease and even change the nature of mosquitoes. Scenario 3 is really the core of this session. If 1 is on prevention participation, 2 on big genome, 3rd is how do we partner for a safer world? So these are the global campaigns for partnership of different institutions. I think it's laudable. The challenge is most of us don't know how to partner. A group of us academics, we said, we'll try the university, let's create our own university. So we created our own web course, our own mini university. After 2 years, we disbanded. We disbanded because we realized none of us liked each other. We actually didn't know how to partner. We didn't have the skills. We thought we did, but actually we didn't. Partnership requires high EQ. It requires moving from hierarchical systems to shared participatory systems, and it requires partners should be incentivized. I know university vice chancellors say, please partner. Everyone says partner, but when you do partner, your individual research quota goes down. Toronto police, they say, let's do prevention. When they're preventing and things are safer, their budget goes down. So we have to incentivize prevention and partnership. It becomes the norm. Otherwise, everyone's too busy. The budgets are for the present. So we become lost in the present. Here's innovation. No thanks. We're too busy. We have too much to do today. There's no way we can focus on the next 5, 10 years. So we talk about, let's save the world. Here's all these new technologies. Here's the warning. Practically, most organizations are unable to do anything real about it. So the notion is we make partnership the norm. If you want bicycles as the norm, then cars become the weird place, and bicycles become the norm. It's a systemic shift. So perhaps the 5th P in health is partnership. The sentence that touched me most today was, you're healthy because your neighbor is healthy. That sets a very different paradigm as opposed to the war on something else. And the 4th scenario is, well, if we don't do anything, we're back to the warning, the return of 1918 flu, and everyone has to partner because the metaphor is shotgun wedding. You have to get together, even if really you don't like each other. Let me conclude with the last use of the future. Of those are alternatives, divergent thinking, the last one is, what's our vision? Where do we wish to go? And our panelists, again, will help us there. If you remember Mr. Mandela, 1952, he made a forecast. The forecast was a vision. In 1994, he realizes the vision, and his parting words to all of us was, it always seems impossible until it's done. Thank you very much. So now let's move to our guests here. I spoke as someone who does foresight work. Let's see what their perspective is. So basically, we're going to ask some quick questions and try to work us and with you to develop some images and some issues around the future. So the first thing I want to ask, and let's just go around here. Let's start with Mark. What are some current issues you see we're facing around partnership for a safer world?
So, well, thank you for that interesting beginning. One of the things that we're struggling with in investing in disease surveillance is the idea that we can't do it alone anymore as the public health sector or even the health sector. That if we try to bring the idea of global health security down to national health security, down to individual health security, that's where it starts for us. So when looking at trying to bring that security to the community level, we need to bring all those partners together. So we're working very hard in some of the innovations that we're doing to bring in the private sector, the telecom companies, the multilaterals, the academic centers, the corporations who sit in the community, along with the human, animal, and environmental health.
Okay, it's a big process and local level, real partnerships. Yeah. Thank you. Let me ask the same thing to Sonia. What's something at the current level you can see going on, either successful or a failure?
Well, I think, I mean, we need a change in mindset,
Okay.
because a number of different partnerships are burgeoning. Some are long-standing, others have been more newly created. But I think we need to change it in mindset, and agencies have to realize that every agency has a comparative advantage. And we need to join the dots, and we need to leverage complementary competencies and make sure that there are no duplications and that synergies are exploited.
So it's a different type of partnership, seeing what works in each agency, what they're good at, and then you put them together.
Exactly. So we have to think in terms of collaborative division of labor,
Okay.
and appreciate who has a specific comparative advantage in an area.
Brilliant.
Because every agency cannot do everything.
Thank you.
I mean, WHO has its health. It has
Yeah.
the framework of international health regulations, which is cascaded in countries in terms of implementation arrangements. It has the health emergency program. Then there is the global health security agenda, which has a specific role. There's GORAN, there's CEPI, there's
Okay. No, this is nice. So it's really collaborative division of labor. I've never heard that before. Interesting idea.
Exactly, and of course then there are a number of different industry initiatives. I mean, you showed that inspiring presentation where predictive analytics and AI and blockchain and the rest of it has very specific applications in the global health security paradigm. And I think there is a fundamental need for a rethink and a redirection so that agencies are able to appreciate that they have a niche role,
Yes.
which they should get very good at, they should play it well, but that in terms of the other specific areas, there are others whose competencies need to be leveraged.
And Mark, you would do that, but at a local level. You would ground it. That's what I heard from what you just said.
Well, when you use that phrase, it reminded me of, you know, one of the things that we realized early on when we launched the Ending Pandemics Initiative was while we focused on surveillance, we knew that there were a lot of other foundations who were part of the great landscape that was needed to really end pandemics. People were developing vaccines or drugs and so forth. But what we realized instead of being, you know, we chose a niche where we saw there wasn't any funding going into surveillance per se, but Ebola caused all of us who were in the donor community to come together and say, all right, well, we each sort of chose our niche so we can move to think. We have to work together so that we know what we're investing in surveillance is helping those who are investing in drug development and so forth. So even though we each are acting within the things that are directly related to our strategy, until we came together as a group, we realized true synergy, because then our investments can be co-invested in others who are doing it for a different reason, but together it's more efficient and we both end up with better results.
Thank you. Let me ask Osman. Osman worked with Chatham House, and I was sitting next to him. He's also a secret travel agent for Kashmir. He's trying to convince me to go on a tour. So please, you have a double message here. So Osman, do you think what they said is possible? Do you share that, or?
Well, firstly, thanks for that nice intro, and thank you especially to the hosts for putting on such a great show and treating us so well here in Thailand. I think from our perspective at Chatham House, we sit at the interface between politics, policy, and global health. And for me personally, the key issue with a partnership is that it denotes an equal relationship between the partners. So equity has to be built into the partnership from the outset. And that's where I see the big challenge, because there's inequity, there's inequality between donors and recipients within the global health security space, between people with the technology who develop the technology and where it's applied and used. And I think therein lies some of the biggest challenges, because that then has an impact on who gets the resources, how they're apportioned.
So collaborative advantage works, but the framework has to be equity, if I've understood you correctly.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
But I mean, I think, and I think it's really important that sort of challenge is illustrated. I think, unfortunately, I'm a public health physician, but I've also recently been reading a little bit of Leo Tolstoy, which is a lethal combination to come into a conference with.
So it's Kashmir, public health, and Tolstoy. Okay, I'm sure everyone will want to have a drink with you afterwards.
Yeah, and I mean, I think but that issue has to be made clear. There is still and I'm going to be quite blunt in saying this. There's a lot of smaller, poorer countries that are supposedly sovereign, but what they spend and what they can put into healthcare and health security is determined by external partners. And there's an excellent example through the 80s and the 90s. We've seen the West Africa Ebola outbreak, and people have commented about what caused it, what didn't cause it. But structural adjustment programs were a big factor in the degrading of health services in the West African countries, right? Even Christine Lagarde finally, I mean, the IMF doesn't say
they messed up, but they admitted it finally.
Don't often admit to, well, any sort of mistakes, but she said that fiscal deficit can be okay in certain circumstances, and that was a big statement to make from the IMF.
Thank you. Let me go on to Marie-Paul. So Marie, how would you like to enter this discussion on what's going on today in terms of partnerships?
Thanks a lot. So let me use also a metaphor.
Thank you.
The one that is well known about the elephant. And everybody, blind people are coming and they feel something different. And when I see global partnership for emerging diseases AMR, I think about this elephant because actually various partners have different intents. At least in the used past, in the used experience, until very recently, the intent of the ones who have the money was to say, these diseases, they are threatening us. So please, you in the South, you keep it there. Okay? So in the South, was often, although nobody said so, they said, okay, this is not my main problem. My main problem is something else. Yes. But as long as you give me money, I will make like I'm interested, and I'll spend your money. Okay? So intent different. Also, the approach is different. The one with the money come often with a vertical approach. This is what we want to do. You should do this, you do this, you do that. Yeah. And the ones who receive the money would like to have something which is more systemic because it helps them resolve their other problems. There's different ideas of governance. So who owns it? As I said, how many reports I've seen or recommendations, countries should do this and that. And quite often it's developing countries. So what I would say is that the use path, one of the challenges that I see is that we are not honest about the intent of everybody. So this is mainly at the global level, I would say, because at the local level, I was very impressed by the partnership in Thailand to tackle AMR with the animal sector, with breeding of animals, all this in a participatory manner.
So the partnership honesty is the start of it.
Absolutely.
Okay. Let me go on to Natalie here, who's with the Rockefeller Foundation. Natalie, I know she's taking notes, which would be nice if they were beamed up instead of just us once in a while. How would you like to add to this?
Yeah, in Plenary Zero, somehow I was, without myself knowing, was counting how many times the speakers were saying work together, and I think it's close to 20 times. Okay. And then I think in Plenary 1, everybody talked about trust. And incidentally, it was about leadership. So I think we kind of know what the main ingredients are in getting partnerships to work. It's just we don't really know what modality will fit. And we might tend to think that there's one global, universal way to create partnerships, but I think we need to also right-size it, see how it works, and really have concrete examples of how to take us there, rather than having them be this big jargony type words that we tend to hear.
So the size is important here in terms of partnership. Yes. Thank you. So let me now go to kind of question 2. This was the kind of, here's what's going on today, which is quite useful. Part 2 of this, well, let's push ourselves in the future. Let's start with Sonia. What might be a disruptor going 10, 15 years from now, or even 5, 10 years, that would change the dynamics of what we're talking about? Is there something you see beyond the horizon?
Well, I think in terms of the disruptor, we have to appreciate that partnerships are not just nice to have.
Yes.
It's not something that you can just opt in if you wish. We all have a collective responsibility. If agencies have the mandate to deliver on specific agendas which will collectively collectively contribute to global health security, then there should be collective accountability as well. Yes. So in terms of the disruptor, I would really push for incentives for collaborative division of labor. Fantastic. And metrics and accountability for whole of system performance assessment.
Okay. So if that would change the game.
I think that would change the game, because we need to have specific metrics for whole of system performance where individual attribution can be accounted for, and individual agencies and actors can be held accountable for how they've performed to deliver on a collective result.
Fantastic.
Because partnerships is not something which is, you know, a tick the box, nice to have, you get together in the room, talk, but you're not responsible for those collective outcomes. You're just responsible for that one little individual outcome. And I think that in my mind, would be game-changing, that broader paradigm change. Now, it's a question of who is going to coordinate, who has the mandate to coordinate, and how will the individual entities accept that mandate and sit within that landscape.
Okay, so let's take, before you go on with your own disruptor, let's take Sania's idea seriously. Any one of you, who should do that systemic intervention, and how could it be done? Anyone want to respond to that tough question? Well, Sania will respond to it even better. Go for it.
Well, I think that the world's leading agency for coordination is the World Health Organization, and I think the onus of responsibility is on the World Health Organization to coordinate the different actors. Now,
a systemic way to ensure cooperation, partnership.
Exactly. Now, the word coordination, collaboration are very difficult words, because there is sometimes a sense that you're encroaching on my individual and the rest of it. But I think that those difficulties notwithstanding, the onus of responsibility, the leadership, the mandate is of the World Health Organization, which we should all respect.
Usman, what would Tolstoy say?
Well,
you introduced him, we didn't. Now you're kind of stuck with him.
So I think Tolstoy, certainly in the latter half of his life, was always batting for the little guy, and I think framing the discussion from that perspective is quite useful. And from the little guy's perspective, having one benefactor is not a good thing, because you're subject to the whims of that one benefactor. Having a multipolar world where there's options for you to choose between, you know, who you can ally yourself to, who will agree to sort of your method of prioritization for your country or your people, is a preferable option. And now we've seen that, you know, there's in the sort of the new world order, there's lots of options for countries. We've got foundations which sometimes have single benefactors, and they can be both good and negative because you're subject to the whim of the owner.
So are you okay with WHO creating a systemic protocol for partnerships?
I mean, I think in the way the world is currently ordered, WHO is the appropriate mechanism for doing this as far as human health goes.
Yes.
But we're talking about things where there's the role of the environment, where there's the role of the animal sector. There's a convention on biological diversity where UNEP is the lead body, and perhaps they need to be brought into some of the conversations around the tripartite agreement, for example. So I think a multipolar world is good for smaller countries and for the little guy.
Thank you. Mark? Either follow up on that or a different disruption. It's your call.
No, it's very interesting. You know, when I think about a disruptive partnership, and while I agree, when we think about something like ending pandemics, you know, we need somebody to be in charge. So certainly we're very big supporters of WHO in that respect, but at the same time, when you look at it from a community level, and here we're supporting a project, and if you were in the last session here in Chiang Mai, Thailand, with Chiang Mai University, that really, when you look at this project, that's a community-owned surveillance system, where for the village health volunteers, the car mechanics, the housewives, everybody who is part of this system, who can take immediate photographs, dead, sick animals, report symptoms in their family. They're reporting whether there's water quality issues, food safety. okay, if you think about building that system in the system we have today, you know, who would build that? Is that WHO? Is that OIE? Is that FAO? Is that the university? Is that the government? But when you take it down to the village level and they build their own surveillance system where the public is literally the system itself. I mean, it's ironic. We call it public health surveillance, but where is the public in that surveillance? So I think that's the disruptor where we're really going to change how we find, verify, report outbreaks faster by building systems that at a community level, those partnerships totally make sense. They are the community. They come together and build it. But I think historically, when we looked at everything from a top down, we would never have created that kind of system because we're in such parallel or a stovepipe siloed programs that to see a community come to their own solutions to solve all of the problems in a true One Health, I think that's where we can see real change.
So I don't want to use the World Bank language, but I'm stuck here using it. So I love the example. So could you see it being portable, upscaling, community-based surveillance models? Or is that just good at the community level? Because this is the tension, right? Between a global way of everyone's doing this, mandated, versus you've done it ground up. I just want you to talk to that tension.
Yeah, I mean, for me, we will have a global surveillance system when we have a mosaic of all of the local systems connected, which is totally possible today. But to think about building a global system from the top and how you're going to do it, we will get there. It's the same when we talked about the Global Virome Project early on today. What a great audacious goal in what they want to achieve. But at the same time, we could be collecting those kind of samples from every outbreak, from every epidemiologic study, from a way that we could get what the Global Virome Project wants as the end result, but in a way that we're saving lives and influencing people and solving every unknown outbreak, and then create that same catalog versus creating the catalog and then hoping somehow it's going to
brilliant. So if metaphor one was all of us looking at the elephant, you're suggesting ground up mosaic, and the large organizations just make sure the mosaic fits. They don't do the ground up work. Usman or Marie-Paul, you want to jump in?
Well, I can't agree more that in terms of, at the global level, that WHO should be empowered, and that's a mandate of WHO to take charge of that. But, and we see some progress, because we see also that at the level, I discussed with John Kengason, the director of the African CDC, and he saw that now that the African head of state start to understand that health and epidemics and AMR is a question of national security, so they are more keen to invest. But I also agree that the community level is essential. And we need to have a democratization of health. You need to have the people and the community ask for health to the government. But we need also to give them, to make sure that there is something for them on their day-to-day life. I was always struck by the ideas, how do we think that the communities will support diagnosis of a dead chicken if they can't diagnose diabetes? If there's if there's a food poisoning, they don't know what it is. So I think there should be integration at the community level, so that if the community does the surveillance, they get also something out of it, of a system which is in place for their day-to-day life and for improving their health in general.
So it's incentivized in some way at a global level. So the mosaic at the bottom gets connected and gets incentivized. Omar, Usman, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I wholly agree with this idea of the democratization of health, but that then means that we need to democratize agencies at the global level. We need to democratize and make accountable agencies at the regional level and empower them to be able to act on their mandates. I mean, it's fine to say WHO should have the mandate, but then it also needs the resources and the independence to be able to act that way. A lot of UN agencies are subject to the whims of one or two blocks of countries.
Yes.
I mean, the UN Relief Works Agency is a perfect example. Yeah. They've had their funding slashed in half. How are they supposed to operate?
Okay, so let me ask, Natalie, do you want to jump in? Okay, so this is the first question was what's going on now. Second is what's changing. And you've come over actually with some great suggestions. Third is there a different future we've not thought of? Usman suggested, well, really change given the structure of global power is problematic. That's kind of what I'm hearing. And that's a hard argument to argue against because it is what it is. Can you imagine a different type of future? I'll ask you first and then let's go around. What might be a different future for global partnerships?
So I think one of the key things is that we emphasize technology transfer.
Okay.
We emphasize knowledge sharing and management. We get
You're giving me suggestions. Let me push you a bit.
Yeah.
So that's suggestions. What would that future look like if it happened? Let me push you a bit to 2025.
So for me, that future would look like if, for example, we're talking about big data and community surveillance. For me, that future looks like that the countries where those specimens are taken from, where that data is being taken from, they have ownership of that data.
Got it.
They have the IP over that data. They have their own laboratories that they can send samples to that will then develop
economic
vaccines and
democracy
interventions.
and incentivized around IP and control. Okay, that's a different future. Any one of our panelists want to continue? Mark.
It just reminds me of a story. I wish I could remember his name. He was the Minister of Health in the Dominican Republic. And we were at a meeting, at a TEFINET global meeting, and he shared a story how he was woken up at 4 in the morning from WHO because there was a potential case of cholera on the island, okay, that came through one of the automated systems that, WHO has access to all these data feeds. He got in the car, obviously it's an island, drove over to the hospital, and it turned out, no, it was a falsified report that ended up, some journalists picked up, and it got into the system, but it was totally false. He vowed that day that he would never get another phone call from WHO from a publicly available data feed that he had no access to, and built their own digital disease detection system for the Dominican Republic. That's where I think the world's going to come. There was a time when, yes, we had to rely on WHO to be the technical experts, to be the ones who could go and do things because we didn't have that kind of local capacity. But we're building that kind of local capacity, and the countries are building that capacity. Their systems, they want to know, they want to be the first to know about something happening within their own country. They should be doing their own research. We should not be taking samples out of that country. They should be sharing that information because they have the capacity to do the detection, to collect the samples, and to do the collaboration. And it's happening very quickly.
So the alternative future is localized, robust, almost Linux-type systems. Sanya, do you want to chime in?
So completely agree with the need for local capacity building and for the need for local actors to be the decision makers. But in terms of your pushing us towards the future, I think in relation to this whole agenda of global health security, the gravity of the situation is not being appreciated at the international level.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, there are only 3 major cataclysmic events which could threaten the viability of humanity and the Earth. I mean, in the short term.
Yes.
Either a meteor could hit or a celestial event, or a third world war could break out, or there's a pandemic which has the same potential as the Spanish flu of 1918.
Yes.
Imagine what it would do in today's day and age of connectivity and intercontinental travel.
Yeah.
And these things are not very much in mainstream conversations.
Yeah.
I was at Davos last week, and the gravity of the situation, the actual threat that something like this could be on the horizon, not in 2025 or 2050, but in 2019. And I think that whole narrative needs to change. Yeah. There has to be an appreciation of what might be in the offing and how imperative it is that we get our act together in terms of, whatever we talked about, the collaborations and the endpoints and the accountabilities and the rest of it. And I think in terms of a future scenario, that is what really needs to change.
So do you think this localized mosaic with global protocols, they could arrest such a global pandemic?
It has to be at both ends.
Yeah.
I mean, you cannot just be top down, and you cannot just have action at the local level without a global framework. So there's a lot of joining of the dots to do here.
That's your story. You've said that twice, joining of the dots. So you see many people who don't join the dots.
Well, there's huge potential to join the dots. That's what I'm saying.
And that becomes part of what we're doing here. Marie-Paul, would you either a disruptor or do you want to add to this scenario? Or a different scenario, what I'm saying, not a disruptor.
I do agree, but I think also that we need, as was discussed in our session, to put the people at the center. To put the people at the center and also to allow them to understand, be sufficiently explicit about what could be a pandemic. They know about what could be. I think most of the people know what could be a third world war. We have everywhere the thing, when the big power, nuclear power, are not happy with together, the threat is coming there, and people understand that. But the threat of a pandemic is not where no. So focus on people, so that citizens ask to government, and then also focus on governance. And Professor Tomori was quite eloquent during the first plenary to say that in many countries there's a question of governments. You just throw more money, and this is more money going to corruption. And I think that this also needs to be put on the table so that we all know what we do about it, and that we allow also, we support people and citizens to ask questions.
So what would that different future look like? And before you answer that, can I get the organizers, we're trying to get Natalie's PC up so you can see some of the great points that have come out. Is that possible, that the feed is not me talking or us talking, but of her PC? If it isn't, that's okay. If it's doable, fantastic.
Well, my world of the future, my future that I would like to see is a world where governance matters.
Okay.
When presidents or whatever, heads of state, when they are corrupt, they are pushed out.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of Mark is saying the solution to health corruption is at the local level incentivized, right? I mean, that's kind of the scenario you're imagining, if I understood you correctly. Okay, no, that's okay.
Please.
No, so her point was yes to everything you three said, but without transparent governance to hold people accountable, then these systems and stories disappear, if I understood you correctly, yes?
Yeah, I guess who's holding who accountable?
Yeah, okay.
So, in the communities that we're empowering to be part of the solution, they're holding their leaders accountable. And I think that's the future, and I think that's when we're going to see real change. I mean, we've seen that happen, for other issues, not for just infectious disease. But I think as people move and we think about the future and, the optimized self and the automated, fever reporting and biometrics and all those things that are going to go in, we're going to have more demand for healthier communities and greater resources. And I think empowering the community is going to drive them to change.
So you can see this alternative future. So now let me ask you, we've kind of developing this alternative vision of the future. What might be a better metaphor for us getting from here to there? The metaphor we used a lot today was the war against. You've suggested mosaic. You've suggested connecting the dots. Is there a better narrative you folks can see? I like those two. I'm just wondering, Usman and Marie-Paul, if you have a different one.
Well, it should be a shared journey towards health.
Yeah, that's not bad. So global health shared journey, we're moving together.
I'm going to be slightly more combative. I think we're in a fight. I think there's over the next 5-10 years, there's a rise of national populism. There's this nationalist ideologies on the march, and that's going to have a big impact at the global level for these institutions that make up the global health architecture on their priorities, on how they operate. And I think
so what would be your alternative metaphor then? Is it back to the last line of defense or the castle as the nationalists march? Okay.
No, I'm starting to get all these visions of Marvel superheroes at the moment.
Okay. Well, there's something to that. Organizations, the superhero archetype becomes very powerful. Which one did you want? The Avengers? Or
I think the Avengers are good.
So the different public
Captain
health
America
institutions become the Avengers for this better future. Okay, That's not bad. So last question before I ask the participants, what's one thing you would like to see happen the next 10 years? I know there's 20 things you want to see happen. You said, here's 1 million or 10 million. Here's one thing you can do. What would you do? Mark?
Well,
just one. I know you want to have 3.
One,
you get
one thing, when it comes to the theme of the meeting, and I know this is about partnerships in particular, but I think we need complete transparency.
Okay.
Complete.
Fantastic.
It's possible now to avoid anything that's detected from being hidden because if the public is part of it, if the community is part of it, it takes it from the politics of being able to hide. So I think complete transparency would really reform a safer world from
That's
emerging
the
diseases.
way to create the partnership, real transparency. Sanya?
Well, mine would be complete alignment between political and economic forces and the global health security agenda.
Okay, so those are aligned. So just a little bit more what that means. I know what it means theoretically, but what did that practically look like?
What I'm trying to indicate is that when there are threats, new infectious threats, there is a strong political and economic disincentive to report them in the first place.
So money and power are working together for the public good.
So that is where part of the problem lies.
Usman, your one thing you would do?
I'd say we need serious institutional reform at the global level, and that includes sort of the Bretton Woods institutions.
Major global shift in international organizations. Thank you. Marie-Paul?
I think there should be, apart from working on the global governance, there should be more emphasis on coalition of the willing in countries where people want to work together, like in Thailand, for example, like in countries who can show that indeed it is possible to have stewardship of antibodies and have access to everybody to the access antibiotics. That it is possible actually to get enough food for the country without adding antibiotics, and that this real story can then inspire the other partnerships to have a scaling up.
Brilliant. Natalie?
Sure. I think for me, if I had one magic wand, I would really raise the alarm bell on the silent iceberg we don't see.
Okay.
So for me, I think the current metaphor is we're in the Titanic and we're just ignoring that iceberg.
Okay. on that fantastic, inspiring note, we do have time for a few of you to say what's the one thing you would do differently, or what's your big disruptor or your alternative future or metaphor. I'm open to any of those. There's mics there. If someone wants to say, here's the thing they would do, or here's their alternative narrative of the future. Or if you want, you can just yell questions at the panelists. That's okay, too. But I prefer something contributing from your view. Please, sir.
I have been the chief architect of open source drug discovery.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, when we will make health not as a business, but as a right.
As a right.
Yeah. And that balance should be the future.
Yeah. So the global right to health.
That's right. And number two, when I will see in these panels and the meetings, if it was an IT meeting, I would have seen 25 years people like Mark Zuckerberg and others changing the world.
Yes.
So you mentioned about IoT of health.
Yes.
And my perception is citizens of the world will get together and the young people actually will take in their hand the digital information, which will make then decision-taking by the policy bodies on data. Today, it is just opinion.
Thank you. So it's a vision and a real thing you want to see happen.
That's going to happen.
Brilliant.
And when this PMNC meeting will have 25 years kids with digital knowledge, sitting here and worrying about health, I think that's the vision.
And that's the structural change you want to see at the next PMAC. 25-year-olds in the panel.
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you. Anyone else? We have someone here. Please.
Hi, I'm Judith Chamian, and I'm with the International Council of Nurses. I don't think that the panel pushed the issue far enough.
Okay. Well, you're welcome too. Please push it further. It's your
trying
moment.
to raise the issue, and I don't have a solution, and I hate to stand up when I don't have solutions. But I've been watching the global agenda and the global organizations like WHO, the UN, and others for the last 20 years.
Yes.
And we hear the same old. And I don't see the discussion. I think the pieces that might have kind of resonated with me is to turn the whole governance and the whole structure upside down.
Yes.
I do believe that the solutions are in the community level and empowering in the community level. And please forgive me, everyone, but we are very comfortable to come to this kind of meetings, spend a lot of money of public funds, and have amazing conversations. But so what?
Okay.
And whether it's the MDGs or the SDGs, are we really moving the agenda, and what it will take to move the agenda?
So I'm going to force you to answer that. What would it take? I know you said you can't answer it, but this is your chance to answer it.
I would actually break up some of those global organizations.
Okay. So you have your solution. Let me go to them. So she's suggesting the breakup. Anyone want to add to that? I appreciate you pushing the boundary. There's one suggestion here. We're too old. The second suggestion is let's break up the big organizations. Usman, you're keen to respond, I can see.
So I might be coming across as anarchic, but I'm actually not.
You already said you read Tolstoy. It's over for you. We already know where you sit.
But certainly, I do feel that there needs to be a regionalization of responsibility. So organizations like the Africa CDC are great initiatives and should be supported and empowered. And at the national level, it's really important to create sort of national public health institutes that are independent, or at least semi-independent from government, that can provide evidence-based
So you agree
guidance.
with the governance shift?
I do, but at the same time, that's difficult to do because ultimately all these organizations are heavily influenced by the politics and by the political will of their political masters. And even in the most open and democratic societies, take for example the US CDC, it's a great organization. It does great work around the world in all kinds of countries,
Sure.
and pushes and helps other countries develop national public health institutes. But in the United States itself, the US CDC cannot do research on gun control.
Okay.
It cannot do research on abortion issues. So
Certain things you can't
you're
do.
bound by the political...
So you agree with the suggestion, you want to push it further, but there's some boundaries. Sonia, then I have another question right there.
I think we've had two great interventions from the floor. I completely agree with Judith. She makes a very important point. There's need for radical surgical reform in existing multilateral institutions, reform that can deliver meaningful transparency and accountability and align those organizations toward real outcomes.
And if we don't, we hit Natalie's iceberg?
Yes, and just if I could have the floor for another 10 seconds, I thought the point about having younger people on the panel was great, because today all the major breakthroughs that we are having in tabular learning and algorithmic breakthroughs, which have the potential to crack some of the problems that we've trying to grapple with for decades, are actually coming from 15 and 16-year-olds and are not coming from people of our age groups. So thank you for reiterating the importance of having younger people on the panel.
We have a speaker there. Please go ahead.
This morning, there was discussion of the diagnosis, if you like, of the problem, how the pathogen is moving around.
Yes.
There was a session about leadership for managing emergencies. It was about really the efficiency of the status quo. And this afternoon, we really need, if the objective with respect to infectious disease is to outsmart the pathogen, do we have a structure which is really counterpart to the actions of that pathogen, which no longer recognizes our clinical silos, which no longer recognizes even our north-south.
We have just a few seconds left. So what's your conclusion then? What's your alternative future?
We do need to have an organization which is dedicated to outsmarting the pathogen.
That's fantastic.
In addition to the clinical silo service.
Brilliant. We're 1 second. What's the last word you want to leave the participants? I said we'd finish by 6, and we will. Mark, last word you want to share. Your favorite word.
Friendship and trust.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Sanya?
Radical reform and a commitment to true accountability for results.
Usman?
Roll up your sleeves and get ready for a fight.
Roll
up your sleeves and get ready for a fight.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Well, I'd say inclusive partnerships with inclusion of also the citizen with their voice, and transparent, honest partnership.
Thank you. Natalie?
Okay, I have to include the iceberg, right?
Okay, bring in the iceberg. That's it.
So let's not be the Titanic to sail towards the iceberg, but let's somehow figure out how to fly over that iceberg into a better future.
Thanks so much. That's a perfect way to end the day. Thanks for your time. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank the panelists. Thank everyone. And we finished exactly at 6.